Well, the president took a bold stand at the UN last week. He had everybody talking about how bold he was, but he took on some big global issues. And I want to place that in the context of Ghana, the continent, and the world tonight, because some of the things he said there at the UN General Assembly has reverberated and has far-reaching consequences that I want us to analyze a bit more with my panel of experts who are joining us from around the world this evening to help us appreciate what the president had said, not only on behalf of Ghana, but on behalf of the continent, to put it more precisely. And I'm delighted to and looking forward to my panel of experts who are joining me tonight. Fascinating panel indeed in prospects. So stay with me. One of the things that jumped at us when we looked at the president's speech, we're looking at the broad themes. One is reforming the UN. I mean, for an African leader to make that demand, he himself cited the likes of Nelson Mandela, who has stood before the General Assembly before and demanded reforms, but he went even further. He put it in the starkest of terms, and that is really what got everybody's attention when he said so. A few things he wanted. He says UN needs to reset. So remember that he's been pursuing his own reset agenda locally. He wants the United Nations to reset itself. A few things he wanted. He wanted a permanent African seat on the Security Council. He wanted an expansion of the veto powers to include other countries, including an African country holding a veto power, and stop this practice where the veto power is absolute. Well, that is fascinating indeed, considering those who hold the veto powers, as we now know, and has been enforced and they've been exercising it over the years: China, France, Russia, United States, United Kingdom. And the exercise is sometimes to advance their own interests. The president says that must stop. And we also have seen over the last few years his challenge of the key functions of the UN and what he believes to be a time for the UN to do an introspection to gauge whether it's serving the original purpose for which it was created, to prevent world conflicts, because as we see, the world is on fire in many places, and the president is questioning the UN itself and asking whether indeed the UN is achieving and keeping to his original purpose. And that is fascinating indeed. We'll analyze that. He also condemns Israel's crimes in Gaza, and for an African leader to take that bold step. Of course, we had South Africa do so. South Africa actually taking on Israel, not only through rhetoric, actually taking action at the International Criminal Court against Israel. And then you have our own president standing there in the United States, where, of course, you have Trump, who doesn't tend to forgive and pays attention, saying that the world has been paying lip service to this and they should call it as it is. And he says if it quacks like a duck and flies like a duck and moves like it, it must be a duck. And he was speaking in direct reference to what is happening in Gaza. The UN has called it genocide. He didn't use the word genocide, by the way, but he was very strong on that particular matter. And of course, he reached a position on recognizing Palestine and calling the rest of the world to act and not stand by and watch this crime unfold. And then he talks about reparations, something that Ghana has been talking about for a while. The former president talked about it. He's also talking about it. Our own former president, he's talking about it too. So on this matter, locally, there is a consensus on that. And our presidents, past and present, including himself, is continuing this practice of demanding reparations from those who colonized us and subjugated many of our kind here on the continent. He makes that point very forcefully at the United Nations. And we've seen one of the several key issues emerge on the back of that, that he's saying to us for the first time, the Ghana is going to table a motion on this particular subject because he wants the slave trade identified as the greatest crime against humanity. So what really will this motion change? Will it bring about any significant movement on this particular subject? Africans and African countries have been pushing for reparations for a long time. We're yet to see this materialize in any material form in terms of what we're asking for. If you read the numbers, BBC UN 2023, they talk about 107.8 trillion as far as the estimated reparation owed to this enslaved states are concerned. So this is a huge amount of money, and African has been pushing for this. That's the president's stance on this. The fact that they want to put forward a motion at the United Nations, change anything, and will it? We'll look at that when my guests sit down for a conversation. Another big theme that emerged is a reduction in aid and resource sovereignty. He talked about that. And does he play into the contradiction that some point to each time African leaders raise a subject when they talk about aid reduction? Of course, the West, it's taxpayers' funds. They choose what to do with it. In that same speech, it talks about the fact that Africa and the global financial system is rigged against the continent. Of course, Africa must find its own resources to remain self-reliant. You cannot complain that somebody's use of his tax resources for whatever purpose. And in this case, the world is moving towards defense. We've seen that. We've seen a 40% drop, according to the United Nations, since 2024. But most of that, if you look at the countries that are doing and making the cuts, a lot of them are making these cuts in international aid and channel it towards defense. It's self-interest, fundamentally. But it is their own resource and taxpayers' funds that they've collected. They can use it as they deem fit. So did the president really have any justification to even raise that point? Because we should be funding our own challenges and fixing challenges by ourselves and finding the money to do so, and not relying on the West on that particular subject. And remember that our former president, Akufo-Addo, started a campaign called Ghana Beyond Aid. That really didn't translate into anything of real value, because as we know, shortly after he said that, we went to the IMF again, and then we started implementing policies that we wouldn't have normally done because we mismanage our economy largely, and leading to that. So that conversation is a conversation that keeps happening, but the president makes the point. We'll put that in context, and what can Africans do to remain, as the president himself makes the point. He talks about resource sovereignty, because he believes part of the problem is that we're just giving away too much to the West instead of keeping the value here. And he makes a very bold point that the days of parceling out vast concessions to foreign interests must end. And I'll ask my Ghanaian panelists who are joining me to weigh in on this, whether this rhetoric, we can match that with the domestic reality, because he's a president now. Are we seeing policies that are making good on this bold rhetoric at the United Nations? But there are big continental global issues that he took on at the United Nations that we want to touch on, and my guest will help us do so. Stay with me. And thank you very much for staying with us here on PM Express. It's always brought to you by Syntax Tanks. It is strong, it is tough. Academic Times and Pepsi and Cavity fight it to the pace. And if you're looking for a tank to store water in, then you're looking for the Syntax tank. You look for the tortoise on it, and that should tell you that is a durable tank and one that you should trust. You can look for them across the country and get one for yourself. Also, the Academic Times Journal is launching soon with 3 distinctive graphic publications and a journal to showcase and empower students across all educational levels. Look for it when it is launched. And the Pepsi and Cavity Fight is one I recommend to you every evening before you sleep. If you're brushing your teeth, look for one, because it's what will deal with the gum challenges to decay, etc. Because Pepsi and every smile matters. My guest joining me for a conversation tonight here on PM Exercise. And now I'm looking forward to this conversation because of how geopolitically very significant the president's tough stance at the UN is. And I want to pick the thoughts on a host of issues that the president took on when he addressed the General Assembly and addressed the world, indeed. Professor Bafo Ejimindia is a former UN senior governance advisor, joins us on Zoom. Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambers, delighted to have you join us. He's the African Union High Representative for Silencing the Guns in Africa, and I'm delighted that he can join us via Zoom also. Dr. Abdel Fattah Musa, a good friend of the station, the ECOWAS Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. I'm pretty certain that he listened to the president and he was glad that somebody was championing the cause of Africa with such vehemence. And the president made no apologies at all that he was really there to champion the cause of Africa. And instead of a lot of things that most countries would wrap in euphemisms, that he didn't at all. He actually says we should not be euphemistic at all about some of the things, and he went ahead to say and speak his mind. I'm delighted that he can join us from the sub-regional continental point of view. And Dr. Alex Vines, Africa Director, European Council on Foreign Relations. I'm happy that he joins us. You've spoken to him many times here on PM Express, but from, I believe, the United Kingdom. Sure. And tonight he's with me in the studio. By the way, he's also Director Chatham House, true? Or?
No, I just finished.
Oh, just finished, so okay. Oh, fantastic. Because the last time we spoke to you in the capacity of Chatham House. Exactly. And so delighted to have you now, European Council on Foreign Affairs. Just before we came on live, you were just asking you about why you were here. And it related to something the President actually said about natural resources and resource sovereignty. He talks about that it's time for the Africans to take control of your resources and not be giving and dictated to when it comes to controlling your own resource. You were doing something in Accra that's sort of talking about something very similar.
Yeah, that's right. I'm here for the West Africa Mining Security Summit, which is supported by the Australian government, Australian High Commission. So all the big mining companies that are operating in West Africa are going to be at this conference, and they're going to discuss security, stability, resource nationalism, the issue of tax. So all these big issues that the President mentioned at UNGA are going to be discussed tomorrow.
Let me bring in Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambers. Doc, I believe you watched the speech. If you haven't, you may have probably caught up on it later or read about it. Give me how do you sum up your reaction to the President's speech last week?
I'll be frank with you that I was really pleased with the speech.
And listen,
to the extent that I reached out to Mr. President to tell him how proud he had made us, all Ghanaians, all Africans, for a speech very eloquently and very well delivered. So I indeed was really impressed with the quality of the speech, the eloquence of its delivery, and the content of the speech. If you can say so, it ticked all the boxes. Talking about our national context, because this is, after all, a platform where all countries come to talk about their own national situation. The regional context, as Africa, and Ghana is always known to be a strong voice for Africa. The President did not miss that. And then, of course, he talked, as you know, about the geopolitical context, the decline of multilateralism at a time when some will say we need it most, and also the wars going on, and other challenges, climate, migration. So it was a very comprehensive speech, long enough to cover all the bases, but short enough to keep everyone really interested in what he was saying.
And we'll come to some of the specifics, because some of the things he talked about, controversial, also because of the powers he was taking on when he spoke about them. So we'll talk about that pretty shortly. Let me bring in Dr. Bafo Dumendia. What stood out for you, Doc?
First, what stood out for me, but please, before then, let me pay my respects to my senior, Dr. Ibn Chambers, a dynamic African nationalist and a diplomat, and I have high regards for him, just as I have for my own brother, Fatah Musa, who worked together in years past. And my good friend there, I don't have met him, but my respects to all of them. Now to the question. First, for me, it was a first time in a very long time that I've heard an African leader at the UN taking on critical issues in such a bold way. It reminded me of Kwame Nkrumah's days, the early post-independence era, when our leaders, Nyerere and the others, and Nkrumah, of course, going to the UN and making our case for the world to listen to us. So when I heard the president's speech, it reminded me of that. I was old enough to see and hear President Nkrumah talking. You see, we have so many challenges that our leaders tend to kind of either out of timidity or because our hands are in their mouths, so we don't want to hit them hard and that kind of stuff. And it's gone for so long. As the president said, if that bird cracks like a duck and looks like a duck and walks like one, please, let's say it's a duck. And that really impressed me. So when you tackle the issue of immigration, the way the Western countries are treating Africans in particular, the way the international financial agencies are simply exploiting us, and many others that he raised. So in a nutshell, for me, it was the boldest speech I've heard from an African leader in a very, very long time. And I'm very pleased with it. I was very pleased.
And Abdul Fattah, you, of course, represent ECOWAS in this conversation. He was speaking not only for Ghana, he was talking for the continent, indeed. And one part of this that epitomized this is when he talked about it took on the US for the blockade against Cuba. Because he says the Cubans sacrificed here on the continent. And we've seen that Ghana has been beneficiary of the Cuban doctors and nurses that they ship abroad, and many African countries. But beyond that, he was speaking for a continent that often has been seen as timid. Our leaders often, because we go cap in hand, unable to take on the global system and global leaders who we fear when we go back to them may cite our bold statements against us and may not give us what we're asking for. But he dared take on a global order on behalf of the sub-region and also the continent. I wonder what the reaction has been at ECOWAS and whether or not among yourselves there, this caught attention. Please unmute for me, Abdul Fattah. I believe we still have him, correct? Yes, please unmute for me. Okay, we'll try and fix that. I know he's trying to unmute because he's on. And then once we get that sorted, I'll get back to him on that. But let's come to Dr. Alex Vines on that point, though. And I want to take some of the specifics. On the Cuban point, it was taken on the U.S. And by the way, the United Nations have countless occasions through resolutions condemned the U.S. for the blockade.
Yeah.
Nothing has happened. Was there any strategic advantage for him and for Ghana, by the way? Because everybody goes to the UN. It's your interest first. Yes, you must speak beyond your local country, preference and what your people want, but you must advance the interests of your people. But he dares speak for the continent in a way where he was taking on a country as powerful as the US.
Yeah. So, I mean, the extraordinary thing is that President Mahama's UNGA speech last week cut through in a way that lots of UNGA speeches don't. And I have a feeling that this is a president that wants to show global leadership in the South. And so he does have an ambition and aspiration to kind of step up to the plate and challenge the global North. So it could well be that Mahama, during the time he was out of office, has been considering what are the areas that he might actually focus Ghana's foreign policy. He's been using various fora, like the TANA fora, which he was chair of, as a laboratory for some of his ideas, because I've seen him in action, testing out ideas in that way. So he was spending the time out of office preparing for this moment. And yes, he's confronted Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump gets confronted quite regularly. The Cuban issue is clearly a bit of a red rag to a bull. It's a very emotive issue for the US administration. But the Cubans did play a constructive role on the African continent. I myself have seen the role that the Cubans played in Angola, for example. 6% of the Cuban population served in the Angolan war in support of the government of Angola. against South African destabilization.
What is the strategic benefit?
Recognized.
What is the strategic benefit of taking on this issue, say for him, for Ghana, in the global context? Is there any?
It is about the numbers game and getting support for Ghana for particular ambitions that Ghana may decide it wants in terms of global governance reform. And so I do see this as an opportunity that Ghana is looking at. Numbers really matter, both at the UN General Assembly and also obviously in the Security Council and other forum. And I think we're seeing a more assertive Ghana emerge in international diplomacy.
And that's a very important point I want to put to. Do have Abdul Fattah on and his microphone working correctly? Okay, we'll try and fix it and I'll bring that. But I'll bring in Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambers on that point. Do you agree that there's some strategic benefit there for us in enhancing Ghana's place in global affairs?
No question. Ghana has been known to be very forthright, to be principled, and to stand for what is just, what is right. And I might say that specifically on the issue of Cuba, President Mahama's position is completely in alignment with the majority of UN members, including, for instance, the European Union countries. They've all been calling for the EU as far back as when I was working in Brussels at ACP EU, as far back as then, had always been voting against UN position. The UN position, US position is a very minority position on Cuba. And so there, frankly, I do not see a huge risk in repeating what every Ghanaian president has held and stated and believed in. That's our official foreign policy position over the years. It's a matter of justice, and President Mahama was very consistent in highlighting that point. Besides, I mean, you mentioned in your introduction, Ghana continues to benefit tremendously from Cuban training of Ghanaian doctors. As we speak now, there are probably hundreds of Ghanaians who are being trained in Cuba. We want to maintain that relations. Today, it's not too many countries who give us scholarship to train our doctors. And the principal line that the president drew there was to say, we have friends to all and enemies to none. So by taking that position, we don't define it as a hostile position against the United States. No, the United States is a friendly country to Ghana. We want to maintain that friendly relationships. At the same time, when there are issues that need to be addressed on the international scene, Ghana will do so forthrightly and in line with our aspiration always to be a people of dignity, a people of pride, who stand for principle and not for expediency.
And on that point, Dr. Balfour Jumindria, he did something similar on the Gaza situation. But the part of it that struck me is he was one of the very few leaders who spoke, who singled out, called out the U.S. for denying the Palestinian leaders visa. And I felt that was really courageous, because this is him now being very frontal with Trump. Because obviously, as we know, Trump would have taken the decision to say his administration, he would have known about this, because it was unprecedented. Because the UN Charter, from what I read, actually obligates the United States to grant visas for traveling heads of state going to the UN. And yet, it happened for the very first time. Then you have an African leader who goes there, looks and the eyes straight into the Americans and say, that was the wrong thing to do, while condemning what is happening in Gaza. And that is where he said, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, you must call it a duck. That was bold, was it not? Kindly unmute for me. I don't have your audio.
Amo.
Yes, I have you now. Yes, I have you now.
But we're open.
Oh, it's you?
Hello? Hello?
Whilst you're trying to fix that, I want my audience who missed that to watch John Mahama on this point.
And supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop.
Okay. Yes. Professor Bafo-Jumandria, your thoughts on that?
Presentation by the president. Excellent, because many countries have been very timid about expressing themselves because of the fear of the Americans and particularly of the Israelis. Israel is well planted across this continent, including our own country, Ghana.
Yeah.
I know recently when some statement was issued on this matter, the Israeli ambassador came out calling a press conference and making some interesting, for me, out of place comments.
Because he actually was here on my show. I interviewed him on that subject, and he was very frontal as in questioning government position on the subject.
And the same way, after the president's speech, he held a press conference again, in a way saying the president came very bold and all. But I could not understand. Maybe Dr. Bin Chambers, who's a veteran in this area, can help us. How can an ambassador in our country always seeking to respond through the media to the president? He's not here for that. No Ghanaian ambassador goes to Israel or America and respond to the statements by that country's president. So anyway, that is just by the way. But I think, like David said earlier, the president really, the 4 years he was out of office, has done him some real good. He has had deep reflections on world situation, the situation in our own country. Domestically, he's calling his program a resetting, and he carried it with him to the United Nations, where he also called for the world to reset. And the resetting, that also affects world peace, all these conflicts that we're having around us. I think that was the basis for his stridency in making that statement. And I think, as I say, he's really brought back the spirit that most Africans want to see, especially the young people. Because for many years, Africa's international diplomacy at the UN has been nearly non-existent, besides platitudes that they go to share with the rest of us. So I think President Mahama certainly strategically is positioning himself to capture the leadership of the continent. Because so far, it's hard for anyone to single out an African country who's leading the Pan-Africanism of old. It's so difficult to find an African leader who stands firmly. Of course, we have to respect President Ramaphosa of South Africa, who really went to the ICC and got the Israelis, to be declared.
But while you mentioned him, there was a risk there. He did that, and then we saw him in the White House being humiliated by Trump, and everybody was stand your ground. He went there, and Trump, as Trump always used to do, start citing evidence that was non-existent. But he felt he needed to do that because some suggested in his own country, the press reports, he was afraid that if he did not go to make peace with Trump, there will be consequences. And there was consequence. Trump cut him back on aid. Then he had to go and try and make amends. Isn't that the same risk our president is treading here?
Look, every step you take in international diplomacy, there are some associated risks. So you have to weigh the risks and the benefits. By the way, after that incident, the U.S. has restored the so-called 5-year visa permits to Ghanaians. This occurred after this incident we are referring to. So sure, Trump, everybody knows. Even innocent people go there, like the president of Liberia, and gets humiliated, telling an African leader, I didn't know you can speak English that well. You know, so for me, what Trump does is not consequential. But of course, the man is very erratic. He can make decisions that can badly affect Ghana. But hey, I'm sure the president and his advisors considered all these things before putting that beautiful speech together. So we should be ready then for whatever consequences that occur.
I mean, Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chabas, I know you have to take leave of us, so I need to bring you in on this point, though. What are the risks to him and to Ghana taking on powers like U.S. and Israel in particular? We've seen the U.S. that is ready to sanction the ICC because they did their jobs. We've seen the U.S. that is ready to cut funding to the UN because they declared there's genocide. And then you have an African leader who's taken on, yes.
Evans,
yes.
On all of this, the U.S. is isolated.
Okay.
The U.S. And I should say the Trump administration, because let us be clear that there's no consensus on many of these actions, specifically the actions vis-a-vis the United Nations. It is not the case that the majority of Americans, in fact, the polling is to the contrary, that the majority of Americans believe in the United Nations. After all, this was an organization which was birthed in the U.S. Many U.S. Thinkers were involved in its founding principles back in the 40s. And over the years, there has been a large consensus around the United Nations. So I would not interpret the isolated actions of one administration to equate with a permanent and lasting position of the United States vis-a-vis the UN. Many of us would hope that it's a passing cloud and that the U.S. historic positions towards the UN and international organizations will be restored in time. As far as Ghana is concerned, we have been very clear in our dealings and our relations with the U.S. They're very transparent. It is not today that any U.S. administration will find out that Ghana has friendly relations with Cuba, or Ghana stands in solidarity with oppressed Palestinian people. Our position on these two issues in particular, which you are highlighting, have been clear over the years. And today, as far as what is going on in Gaza, the U.S. is isolated in its support for the extremist genocidal policies of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who even goes as far as to defy President Trump himself to attack U.S. allies such as Qatar.
Yeah.
That's an aberrant behavior internationally. It has been widely condemned, and we cannot be apologists for someone like that. And talking about the behavior of his ambassador, it is completely undiplomatic and only brings to light what happened recently in France when the French foreign minister had to call in the Israeli ambassador, and I hope our foreign minister will do likewise, to remind him about diplomatic etiquette. In that case, as in this one, the ambassador had the temerity to take on the French president on the Gaza position of France. And France found it totally unacceptable and had to remind him about the ABCs of diplomatic behavior and conduct. So that may be called for here if he persists in this behavior. He cannot disrespect our president in our country, and I don't think that we should tolerate that.
Yeah, Dr. Mohammed, I know you have to take leave of us. So the final question to you on what you believe the long-term gain will be for Ghana in its place in the world on the back of this very bold speech?
Well, the president's speech also, as you know, by the way, as we're dealing with international issues and as the chief mediator of the crisis in Sudan, I was particularly pleased that President Mahama was one of few who brought this to international attention. And I congratulated him, and I said, Mr. President, you have given voice to voiceless millions of Sudanese, 12 million internally displaced, and 3 million refugees. And this conflict has just been put on the back burner. So we need to appreciate our president for being the Pan-African he is, to bring this conflict also to the front burner and to draw international attention to it. But where we go from here is what he alluded to. We need to roll up our sleeves. We are hugely endowed, and we need to take control of our resources, harness our resources, add value to our resources, educate our populations, and reach out to all partners. Once again, we are friends to all, we are enemies to none. You recall that going back to our immediate pre-independence days, the position of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah leading the non-aligned movement, working for African Union, did not prevent him from cooperating fully with the United States. And he built good relations with President Kennedy, and before him, President Eisenhower, who helped us to build the Volta Dam. So our position has always been that we shall deal with all countries on the basis of equality, mutuality of interest, respect for our sovereignty, and respect for African solidarity.
Dr. Mohamed Ibn Chambers, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. And I must say that I'm delighted that he spent time with us, although he was slightly under the weather there, because this is an absolutely important subject. And I'll bring Abdul Fattah into a conversation pretty shortly, because I know we've managed to resolve the challenge there. But Alex, weigh in quickly on the subject for me, on the potential risk here of the president's position on Palestine, yes, but also the fact that he took on the U.S. for denying the visas to the Abbas and his delegation. I think he, possibly if I'm not wrong, I think it's only Russia and Ghana that directly isolated the subject and called that the U.S. on. Is there any risks?
Look, you already heard, I think that the president and his team had done a risk assessment. I think also timing. Remember that many countries had just recognized Palestine at UNGA, a host of European ones and more globally. Also, Trump is upset with Netanyahu. Netanyahu was forced to apologize tonight to the Qataris and looked miserable by doing that. So Trump himself, his position had slightly moderated anyway in the run-up to UNGA because of what the Israelis had done by the attack in Qatar. So all of this, I think, meant that an appraisal by Accra was, in Flagstaff House, that this was the moment to be assertive. And so the United States is very isolated on this particular issue. And I think the dispute with South Africa is a lot more ideological. And so I don't think what happened in South Africa necessarily you can suggest is the same sort of risk for Ghana either. So I think you shouldn't bring those two things together.
I mean, also because Trump's posture has always been, if you criticize me, he's so transactional, I'll find a way to exact my pound flesh.
I mean, so the United Kingdom, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, we just had a state visit to the United Kingdom, and both the King, but also the Prime Minister, had conversations about Gaza, Palestine, and had warned Trump that they were going to recognize Palestine. And so in the press conference with the Prime Minister, Trump said he disagreed, but he kind of agreed to disagree. So there are ways of managing
But this is the UK. We're talking about Ghana, a small country in West Africa.
Oh, but I think so many are doing this. Macron also, that I think...
But those are world powers. I guess that is the difference here, right? These are world powers. They can't take on Trump in the US.
But I think we're seeing a slightly changing position of the Trump administration around Gaza, Palestine. Now, that's the Trump administration still is not to recognize Palestine, but what's come out tonight from the press conference and the meeting with Netanyahu is a kind of a new look at a roadmap to try and get at least a cessation of hostilities. The broader international consensus is still the one that President Mahama said at UNGA, which is a two-state solution.
Exactly.
That's what Europe is pushing for. That's what the majority of the world is pushing for. And the United States is incredibly isolated in this regard, as is obviously Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
And that's a fascinating point. Both Dr. Alex Vines and Ibn Chama's making the point that this is a calculated strategic risk that was taken because the risk assessment had been done. If you missed that point, this is John Mahama before the UN General Assembly on this.
Alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations.
And thankfully, I can bring in Dr. Abdul Fattah Musa into the conversation now, and grateful that you managed to stay with us, and thank you very much for your patience, indeed. What has been the reaction, the chatter among your colleagues at ECOWAS on the back of this speech by our President, John Dramani Mahama, the UN?
The first feeling was that of pride. Do not forget, we should contextualize the speech of Mahama in historical terms. He started by, tracing where the world has come from since the League of Nations after the First World War, through the Second World War, and the post-Cold War period of the unipolar world, up to where we are today in a multipolar environment. In charting that, he contextualized the current state of global governance. Global governance at the level of the United Nations, the Security Council. We shouldn't forget that President John Dramani Mahama is the African champion on reparations. Right? That is one of the key areas that he's leading. And under the theme of reparation, one key demand is the reform of the Security Council. The Esselwini consensus actually asked for 2 permanent seats for Africa and then 5 non-permanent seats. So we go maximum, and then, we see what we can get. So President Mahama is demanding at least 1 seat with veto power, and which is also more important. What is very telling from President Mahama's speech was the recommendation that he made, that if any of the 5 veto-wielding powers try to wield that, the United Nations General Assembly should find a mechanism to make sure that they negate it.
Yeah. That veto is not absolute.
Exactly. So that was a very important thing. But that is not all. He talked also about the global financial and economic relations that are all tilted against the continent of Africa, which also, I think was a very, important element of it. And dwelling on that, he talked about, what you said earlier on about Africa is going beyond aid, that we are not going cap in hand, and that Africa is very endowed. So the only thing is to add value to our products and what is it, so that we can compete equally on the international market. But the most important thing that he said is the wealth that Africa has, not under the ground, not at sea, but our demographic shifts. The demographic shifts in the world. That by 2050, where Africa's population will be about almost like 25% of the world population, and then the young people, who also constitute a very vast resource in Africa that we should talk about. So he is directly appealing to those who are drawing up what you can call the modern Iron Curtain, Fortress Europe, and others, who want to prevent the young people of Africa from crossing the Mediterranean, going to Europe, on even legal migration, and telling them that the demographic trend is in favor of Africa, and Africa will be the leader in the final analysis in the world. So for ECOWAS, President Mahama actually demonstrated his Pan-Africanist credentials. He spoke for Africa, even though he made a few points about where Ghana is going, the resetting, and also the 24-hour economy. Economy and all that. He talked about that. But most importantly, I think what he said, which resonates with the rest of Africa, is about the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of slave trade before that, and the scramble for Africa that he also mentioned that at times we tend to forget. He mentioned all this in the context of what is happening in the world today, and called for reparations. And you mentioned how much the continent is owed, but you should know that Africa is both Africa and the diaspora, the Caribbean, and then the others with this, and then we see the black community in the world coming together, pressing for reparations for the more than 12.5 million, black people who were carted away from Africa during the colonial period, and the slave owners during the abolition of slave trade were paid compensation, for releasing their slaves and then leaving the slaves in the lurch, and then the continent from which they came, also in trouble. So what President Mahama was trying to put across was a clarion call from Africa, as a leader of Africa, talking for Africa, and then pressing, for Africa's interest in the global economy.
Yeah, and on the global economy, let's challenge some of the things he said there a bit more, because he says, and I want to quote him, we demand not only a reform of the Security Council, and I'll come to that because that many African leaders have demanded. You said there's already in place a resolution for that, two permanent places, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which he says is currently rigged against Africa. I mean, I recently was reading a report by the World Bank. It was published last year, called The Governance in Sub-Saharan Africa in the 21st Century, which actually concludes that governance deficits, institutional weaknesses, corruption, unstable and unpredictable policy making in African states reduce the ability to effectively use or contest global financial mechanisms. In other words, if it has been rigged, it's because we have chosen not to do anything about it, or because our own internal arrangements, governance-wise, in terms of our predictability and stability of our policy is not coherent enough to do something about this. In other words, it is our own doing. It's not the fault of the West that the system doesn't seem to favor us.
Yeah. Look, what I will say on this is that this is blaming the victim for his or her situation. This is what is happening today. The problem with the Bretton Woods institutions that were set up after the Second World War, whether you are talking about the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, is governance architecture completely marginalizes Africa. So the unity of Africa, listen, Africa has been very united in its demand for a permanent seat at the Security Council. Right? Since at least 2005 with the Esselwini consensus. Up till today, the nearest we have come to that is the US conceding that Africa, deserves a permanent seat, but with a caveat.
But what makes us deserving of a permanent seat, though? Where's the economic and military governance might to deserve a seat at the UN Security Council?
Very fine. Look, when the UN Charter was adopted in 1945, Africa had only 4 representatives at the table. Today, Africa has 54-55, about 1/4 of the entire, UN family. Today, that is one numbers. Number 2, when you take any UN peacekeeping mission on the continent, and in fact, the recent UN missions in Africa, almost 80% of the troops, that constitute the UN's peacekeeping agenda, they are drawn from Africa. So Africa's role is just about its economic might, but what it has done to guarantee global security in terms of providing the muscle, the troops that actually have kept the peace across the continent and beyond. So that is, also something that we have to think of. These 2 elements alone, the sheer numbers of Africa, and if you hear diplomacy is just not about the powerful, it is about who can influence decision making. So the financial institution that we are talking about, was it Africa that was disunited, that allowed structural adjustment arrangement to be imposed on the continent in the 70s and 80s? And that the rate at which Africa, they lend money to Africa is far so exorbitant compared to the developed countries. We do not have a seat, when it comes to the governance architecture of, of all these institutions. And what President Mahama is calling it, there must be a change, in that particular,
and I want to bring in Dr. Alevine into that conversation on the global financial institutions rigged against Africa.
Yeah.
African countries have often said that it's almost playing the victim all the time. And what a lot of the reports who challenge this say, but look at your own affairs. You really don't deserve what you're asking for. At least, if African states have stronger institutional capacity, better macroeconomic policies, more predictable regulations, better domestic financial system, the argument had been, we'd be in a far better position to really challenge those, but we don't have so. And so we've allowed that to fester. That's not the fault of the global institution, it's our fault.
Well, look, there's a crisis of global governance institutions. So there is a crisis. It is unequitable globally. The Bretton Woods institutions of the UN Security Council reflect a world that doesn't exist any longer. So President Mahama is absolutely right to highlight that. But you're also very right. I read the same report as you from the World Bank, that many of the problems are also political here in the continent, and it requires political will and leadership to provide strong institutions, good governance, transparency, technocratic administrations. And some African countries are better than this and others, and you can see the flows of foreign direct investment follow around that too. So why do people invest? Is because of a predictable regulatory framework. That's one of the discussions that I'll be sitting in tomorrow, is why actually is capital leaving some of the Sahelian AES states and going to a country like Cote d'Ivoire to invest in the gold industry. It's because of some of the regulatory and security and other contexts that Cote d'Ivoire hopefully will offer post the election coming up. So there are plenty of choices around. I think the big question actually for a country like Ghana is, how does it now handle a world of multipolarity? We're in an a la carte world. There's a lot more choice now than there was, including what Abdel Fattah Musa was saying 20, 30 years ago. And how do you have the statecraft, the skills to navigate all these different possibilities? Ghana's joined the Francophonie under the previous president. Does it want to be a member of the BRICS? There are all sorts of different coalitions now that are there as a menu. So how is Ghana going to navigate that? Because I think that's the world that we're entering into very, very quickly. It's not it's not like the Cold War where there's, say, Russia and then the West. It's a lot more complicated now, is what we're seeing. And that, I think, is what President Mahama was trying to cut through, but also try and argue that there are big issues in the world that the world needs to come together and should not be polarized.
Fundamentally,
like climate change, like some of the global governments.
But do you fundamentally agree that the global financial institutions, the entire architecture there, is rigged against Africa?
It reflected the end of the Second World War, and also the realities of a very weak African agency in the early post-independence period. Even with the assertiveness of Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism, Africa was disadvantaged. And I do agree with Abdel Fattah Musa, the numbers game really does matter. I mean, 25% of the world by states is African, 54, 55 states. And the 2050 figure of the demographics means that a significant part of the future world is going to be African. And so creating fortresses also, like in Europe, to kind of push back against that isn't going to be sustainable in my view. So we're going to have to redesign a new system. And that's, I think, why you need leadership, and why I welcome President Mahama's speech, because there needs to be fresh thinking in these international fora. Otherwise, they're really boring, just very narrow platitudes and clapping, and you move on to the next speaker. UNGA has been pretty dead for a number of years, but it came alive with particularly with the Mahama speech, but also the recognition of Palestine, for example, so many countries this year.
Yeah, doing something different. I mean, and Professor Bafo Ejimendria, please weigh in on that for me, on the bigger questions that John Mahama was canvassing there around resetting the global order, and particularly the UN itself. Let's go back to that age-old demand, getting a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and you advised at that level. Do we deserve it? And I don't want you to just say it because it's something that we've said. Strictly speaking, I've heard the population argument, but is that enough to warrant a permanent seat on the Security Council just because we are 25% of the global economy by 2050?
Evans, these are what I believe to be the facts. There's no question in my mind that there's a need to redesign the architecture of global relations that's post-Second World War. We need to. But when they were designing the international financial institutions and the whole security system in the world, Africa was not represented, and therefore the interest of Africa was not taken into account. In fact, the financial institutions were set up almost exclusively to get Europe back on its feet after the war, after the devastation of the Second World War.
But post that, the evidence shows that monetary terms, Africa has benefited far more from the IMF. For example, as of 2024, over 1/3 of IMF member countries with active programs are in sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh, Evans, take your own country into
Exactly.
17 times. And in our language, the Akan language, there's a proverb, a funny one, but it says that the fool will not allow his somewhere to be stepped on twice. You never step on a fool something twice. In our case, they have stepped on our that something 17 times and we are still going to them. So if you ask me honestly, what benefits have we gotten? Deepening our indebtedness? That is not what you...
No, but Prof, seriously, if you look at it though, if without the IMF, Ghana would have been bankrupt. Let's look at the last one. We wouldn't be where we are now, that we are now thinking about reopening the bond market locally. We have restructured our debt only because of the IMF. And it's a reason why we go, it's not their fault. This is us.
We see we have been caught in a trap. And we have nowhere else to go now until we go to the IMF. If the IMF did not exist, I believe there would have been an alternative to the IMF. Whether that would have been favorable to us or not, that's a different story. But for the past 40, 50 years, all our countries in Africa, especially Ghana, we have been entrapped and we are caught in it. How do you get out of it? For me, is the question that we need to seek answers for. So I'm saying that, first, there's a need for restructuring the global architecture. But after saying that, I also want to stress that getting a membership of the Security Council will not solve African problems. It will give us a voice at the United Nations. That poverty will be there if our leadership in this continent does not change the quality of leadership. So, as we are seeking to get membership, it's more important for our leaders to rethink how governance in our countries should run, and more importantly, it's important for our leaders to reconsider the notion of African unity that Kwame Nkrumah proposed. Because as 54 individual states, we are still dispersed. We don't have collective power here. So if we are interested there, then let us continue the unity agenda. Let the AU become the Africa that we want, so we have one voice represented at the Security Council. For me, that is the way to go.
But Prof, you touched on something, because I have Abdul Fattah that I need to put to him. He's speaking for ECOWAS. Even ECOWAS, at that small level, we can integrate. We've been talking about the single currency for decades now. So how do we make what you're saying possible when even at a small corner of West Africa, we can't get our act together and get one economic community, which was the original object of those who formed the ECOWAS? Abdul Fattah, how do you respond to that?
Yes, you know, in a very simple way, that what President Mahama was advocating at the Security Council is the fight against the system that makes sure that the adoption of the ECO, the single currency in West Africa, became a shifting target. Okay, and it is that lack of unity. And you see, today, there are more calls, you know, for the ECO to come, you know, into being. So the thing is, there were factors. In fact, even if the IMF today is being more receptive of the positions of Africa, it is because the Bretton Woods institutions know that there are alternatives that are springing up. We have the New World Bank. We have a lot of other alternatives. The whole process of de-dollarization, which is going on. It's not an easy thing. It is something that directly impacts the very foundations of these Bretton Woods institutions. So they themselves have to adapt. But the most important thing, and it comes back to the question that you raised, and Bafo Ajumandi also raised it, the question of the continental unity.
Exactly.
We have already, look, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is a mechanism that everybody has to come around to make sure that intra-African trade goes beyond the meager 11-12% that it is today. You know, to make sure that we trade among ourselves, we add value to our product and become competitive on the world market. So President Mahama's clarion call is exactly what also Alex Vines was referring to, right? That today we are in a multipolar environment. In fact, some call it the multivectoral, activity. You do not need to box yourself into one corner, right? Because in today's world, as the Finnish president was saying, also at the Security Council, it values interest and power. And Africa has to know where its interest is. We don't need to box ourselves into one corner. We have countries like India, Brazil, and others, and the very notion of non-alignment that Kwame Nkrumah espoused and other things is actually where we are living, today. President Mahama said we want to be friends of all, not enemies of anybody.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Nkrumah put it in another way. We look neither east nor west. We look forward. Okay. I mean, it is the same jargon. Today, are you boxing yourself into BRICS, into the G7, G20, or anything like that? Where is Africa's own agency?
Yeah.
And this is actually what Mahama was talking about.
Can I rephrase that question? Where is ECOWAS' own agency in this matter? Because you're here, I need to ask you that. Because have we shown, even in the assert region, that we can unite? As we speak tonight, there are trailers and trucks just traveling into Nigeria to do business that will be stopped countless number of times. You can't even trade among the West African states. How can we fix the problem at the continental level so we are respected at the seat of global decision making? Speak to the ECOWAS challenge for me. What's the problem there?
Yes, when it comes to the ECOWAS situation, if you take the whole of the continent of Africa, right, ECOWAS is the only region with a multilingual background. Okay, Portuguese, French, English. These three countries. You go to the SADC region, it is virtually all Anglophone. You go to central, region of Africa, it is virtually all Francophone. We have it. The fact that ECOWAS, despite this, were able to even come together in 1975. That is number one. And is the it is the avant-garde region on the continent with visa-free movement. Okay, the entrepreneur, Dangote, in a recent statement said that to travel across Africa, he needs about 38 visas. Okay, in West Africa, we don't have, that's a building block, which. And then, we have the Equal Trade Liberalization Scheme, which is being championed by His Excellency, who are just, left now, Dr. Ibn Chambers is the one. Yeah, so ECOWAS is moving there. And just recently, the ministers of defense and finance agreed to autonomously fund a counter-terrorism force. Because, you see, we are talking about trade. We are talking about that. One of the defining factors, President Mahama talked about misinformation and disinformation, fake news and all that. Beyond that, it's actually terrorism and violent extremism that defines West African, space today. So this is where we are. The activation of the force stabilize the country, because you cannot talk about a normal economy except you are going to talk about a war economy when huge tracts of our territories are controlled by non-state actors. And so there is a movement. There have been challenges, right, with even, maybe you didn't go there, that ECOWAS 15-member countries today is reduced to 12, right? And efforts are being made, actually, as we speak, to bring the two parts together. So this unity is there, that is there. But I can tell you, that ECOWAS has made strides across its, history that is incomparable in any other region. Okay. So normally we sort of attack ourselves because we don't appreciate, that anybody can get up in Accra and then move all the way to Senegal without visa or something like that, because we've taken all those for granted. You know, so there have been real.
There's been some progress, and this is really what the John Mahama speech does. It forces us to do some real hard soul searching about the big issues that stop us from achieving the big ideals that he professed beyond the United Nations. And I want to take a quick break. When I return from the break, there's something else he said that we need to interrogate, because he almost complains when he says, quote, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. He says since July 2024, there has been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid to Africa. And so what? It is the taxpayers' money. I'll ask my guests weighing on this, because that always is the aid trap. And as Dambisa Moyo says in a very famous book, Dead Aid, aid sometimes can be the ultimate tool to subjugate. So what's President John Dramani Mahama right in even raising this subject in the first place, when he, right after that paragraph, he talks about us taking charge of our own resources? Stay with me after this. And thank you for staying with us here on PM Express. It's just about wrapping up on this big conversation on the back of Mahama's seminal speech before the United Nations General Assembly last week. We've been unpacking that. We've looked at the various angles to this and its implication. I want to end by looking at how he himself ends that speech. And he ends that speech by doing something that most African leaders tend to do. And very brief comments on this, Alex, first to you. On that quote that I read before we went on that break, it says an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. And then he talks about the data which is verified. Since July 2024, there's been 40% drop in humanitarian aid to Africa. Was he justified to mention this, especially when you look at the fact that his whole speech was broadly in the context of African sovereignty and Africa really being at the forefront of doing big things and not being shortchanged? Can he then say, almost complain, that others with their taxpayers' funds are deciding what to do with it?
Look, aid needs to be repurposed. A number of African countries got over-dependent on it. I mean, the shocks have really been clear with the sudden ending of USAID. So a country like Liberia doesn't know where to turn, so dependent on international development and from one particular donor partner. And so he should have, I would have thought, framed it more about the repurposing of international development, which is important, and that it should be developmental. Shouldn't be paternalistic like the old-fashioned relationships were between the European Union and Africa, for example. And there is this worrying trend of the repurposing of some of that money into defense industry. Yeah. And so the reality, even in Europe, is there's modeling now about will Europe start to consider exporting more defense equipment and weapons to Africa, which is something that has diminished significantly in recent years. And you've seen spikes of Russian, Turkish, and other defense providers providing those services. So I think there's something there. But the idea that Africa should be entitled to international development from outside the continent, I think is misplaced. Africa should stand on its own 2 feet. I think that's a really important point. And then there's always going to be a need for emergency assistance because of cyclones, famines, Ebola, you name it. And there, the COVID pandemic, again, showed double standards, especially over vaccines. And so it is about how can African countries become more resilient to external shocks. And that is about building up your own pharmaceutical platforms, but in better equitable partnership with others, including Europe.
I mean, Dr. Bafo-Juman, your final thoughts to you, and on that point, linked to sovereignty, he says, quote, in this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The president he succeeded talked a similar language and couched it as Africa beyond aid, well, Ghana beyond aid, if you like more specifically. We know he failed at delivering on that because he went to the IMF, and we know the rest is history. He started talking the same language, and this bold speech is really that signal to us. That's the reality here. In the last 8 months, match the rhetoric he delivered at the UN General Assembly? And do you have confidence that he will chart a different course, more in sync with the posture he took at the UN General Assembly over the next 4 years?
Okay, Evans, even if the former president talked about Ghana without aid, it doesn't mean it happens in a year or 2 years or 10 years. It's a long-term process. Just that the former president failed to give us a strategy for pursuing that policy. Now, the President Mahama's point that you made, I think the president couched it well. Of course, at the moment, no African country can do without aid. But the fact that we have seen the drastic drop of aid levels in a short period of time, for me, that is an instructive that the African leaders should begin to rethink how they domesticate their own development. As I think Alex said, we need to begin to look internally. In the previous discussion that my good friend Fatah, all of it, made about African unity and how we try to come together to build, I think the president had landed his speech on rallying African up. Let's rally up for the new path that we need to take in view of the drastic drop in the aid. In fact, I agree with Alex that, and I know that no country in this world has developed on the basis of charity. We cannot rely on international charity for our development. And that should instruct us to really think how we can. I know all the obstacles we have trying to achieve African unity. And I think Fatah made an excellent point demonstrating some areas that ECOWAS has even been successful, that today you can travel without visa to some countries. And some other African countries outside the sub-region are unilaterally also giving free visas to all African passports. And I think if we can begin to get 1, 2, 3, 10 African countries doing that, it will catch up with everybody. So in the same way, when we are talking about African unity, we are not talking about tomorrow, but we are talking about countries that can identify their common interests, like the Sahelian 3 countries have done. Those 3 countries, they have identified a common, a common enemy, a common strategy, a common vision, and they are working together. That's why they and the former
apologies because of time, but does John Mahama have your vote of confidence that he can continue to chart this course and turn the rhetoric into reality locally, domestically?
I'm waiting for him to come back and see the kind of policies. These are declarations at the UN, big declarations. Like somebody said, Ghana without aid. That's a declaration. Now let us begin to see the policies that will reflect the strategies that we are going to embark upon to take us where you want us to.
Okay, great.
So for now, let us take that. The declaration was prepared, but we need to.
Abdul Fattah, I just have a minute, if you may. Weigh in for me briefly with your final thoughts on this.
Yes, thank you very much. Look, what I would say is that, number one, President Mahama made certain declarations. How do we contextualize that within the implementation of the Ghana Reset? And then the 24-hour economy. A whole lot of very positive elements are in there. That is the first point I would make. The second point that I will make is that there is no contradiction between Mahama talking about military spending globally and then drop in humanitarian assistance. Note the word humanitarian assistance. Why? Because today, if you go to most of our countries in West Africa, terrorists are using unmanned aerial vehicles in attacks, IEDs and others. And I think President Mahama alluded to that. Meanwhile, you have the NATO countries that have just agreed to increase defense spending by 5% of GDP. right? So while we are talking at the African continent level, of silencing the guns. Okay, guns are being produced, and we have their consequences in places like Sudan, in Libya, in the Central African Republic, in the DRC, and in the Sahel, of Africa. So what he is saying, what Mahama wanted to allude to, is that these weapons that are being mass produced today in Europe, this autonomous weapon system, very dangerous, what is it, controlled by artificial intelligence and all that, will eventually end up on the African continent.
Yeah.
And then, at the same time, humanitarian assistance to respond to the harm being caused by this weapon is falling. So where are we going?
Yeah.
I mean, that is the. I think that is the question.
That's how you. That's how you contextualize it. Yes.
The thought that.
Yeah, Doc, I'm grateful. I'm grateful that you joined us, both Professor Bafo Jimendia, Dr. Abdul Fattah, and Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambers, and of course, Dr. Alex Banks, who joins us. And all the best with your program in Accra over the last few days. Enjoy the rest of your evening.